One of the things that I'm going to be talking to you about today is the skills of the modern researcher. Before I do, I thought I'll tell you a little bit about me and my career. So I was born in the UK originally, and ever since a young age, I like building things. I would play with Lego in my room, and I would build space stations and pirate ships and islands and cars. The problem with Lego is that you have to fit the pieces together. And it's very constraining, especially when you want to build things that your imagination is just running wild. So at the age of 8 years old, I learned how to program. So I had a Spectrum 128K, that's how much memory it had. And I would make games for myself using Visual Basic, which was the first programming language that I learned. Fast forward a little bit, and it got to choosing a subject to study in college, and I was like, well, I've been programming for a long time, so maybe computer science is something that I should do. So I studied computer science at the University of Bath, and it's a pretty good university for computer science. It was number 3 the year that I graduated in the UK, Oxford and Cambridge, just above it, so just missed out there in terms of being number 1 or number 2. My final year project, we had to build like this, we basically had to make a big application. And the application that I made was a wireless mobile conference assistant for the British HCI conference that was happening at the end of my final year. Now this was back when we didn't have smartphones. You had pocket PCs had just come out, and they were about this thick. And in order to get Wi-Fi connectivity, you had to slide them into a sleeve. And then you had to put a Wi-Fi card into that sleeve, which made it about this thick. I basically built the system, and I learned about human-computer interaction, and I got to go to this conference. And this led to a fascination with building systems with humans in mind. So I decided to stay on at the university and to basically study my PhD in computer science, although I was specializing in human-computer interaction. And during that time, I was building design tools, which was, back then, it was like these big tabletop systems and tablet PCs and pocket PCs, and it was basically vector graphics, which back then was really novel. Today, it wouldn't get you a PhD, but back then it could. After doing all this, I thought I was going to be an academic, so I went to study my postdoc at Oxford. I finally made it there. And I spent a year there, and I was basically doing lots of research. I wasn't doing any building. I was just like watching people using computer systems, and I would write these very large reports, about 40 pages or more, that would get handed off to research councils. And I was really questioning to myself, what is the impact of this work? Where is it going? And I was talking to my manager about this at the time, and she was saying, maybe in 25 years, you're laying the foundation for the systems that are going to be built in the future. And for me, 25 years was not quick enough. So I decided to move to industry, and I had my first job at Microsoft, where I was working on Office, Microsoft Office. Some of the products that I worked on there was Microsoft Project, Microsoft Visio. Hopefully some of you have heard of those products, maybe even used them. And also got to work on all of the global translation and language suites for the Office product. Now, after 3 years at Microsoft, I was like, wow, that's a really long time to be working on a product. So I wanted to be working on something that was a little bit quicker. So I decided to move to Google, and I was the first researcher on Chrome, which is the web browser. Hopefully some of you use the Chrome web browser. Back then, it was the number 3, the number 4 web browser, and during my time at Google, the time I left, it was the number 1 browser in the world, so that was like, yay, we're building a great product. I also got the chance to work on Chrome for mobile, which didn't exist when I joined, so got to see that through from the very foundations of like, how do people browse on the web, to actually designing a browser that enabled it to be as simple as possible. Also, Chrome OS didn't exist then, so got to see that all the way through. And then I also got to work on a number of other projects, such as well as a little bit of Android and search. Now, the one frustration that I had working at Google was there was one limitation about all of this research and product development that I was doing, and that was me. There was only so much I could do. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to build a team of people who could do research. Now at the time at Google, it was still relatively small and it was really hard to get headcount. So I kept trying and trying to get headcount. Eventually I got a contractor to work on the team, and eventually I got a full-time headcount, and there was like 3 of us. But it wasn't moving fast enough to meet my expectations. And right around this time, Facebook came over and said, hey, how would you like to start the Instagram research team? And I was like, sure. So I moved over to Facebook. You can see a pattern in my career of just like moving to the competitors. So I went to Facebook, and I was the first researcher at Instagram, and I moved from, I was doing a lot of research to begin with, but part of my job was to establish a culture of research within the company. 2 was to build a team to actually execute on that research. And then 3 was to elevate research amongst the executive leadership team. And over the course of 3 years at Instagram, I was able to achieve those 3 goals. When I left, there was 16 researchers on the team. So initially there was just me. The design team went from 6, including myself, to over 30 designers. And Instagram, when I joined, was about 90 people, and when I left, it was over 600. And we had just under 100 million users when I joined, and then over 600 million when I left. And then today it has over 1 billion, which is like crazy to think that that many people use an app to take photographs and look at photographs. But at the end of my time at Instagram, my wife and I decided to go traveling around the world. And at that time, I actually decided to start my own company as well. So I built my own company where I'm guessing many of you have either created a survey before or taken a survey. And you tend to like send an email and it opens up in a web page, and people see the questions and they click on the answers. One of the things that I did was built a product where instead of answering questions through a web page, you answered questions through a messaging app, such as Facebook Messenger. So a bot would basically ask you questions, and then you would chat back the response, and it would record that, and then basically have a conversation with you. So when I came back to the Bay Area after the year of travel, it was time to actually get another job. And that's when I decided to join Uber. One of the things that really struck me, actually when I left Instagram, was I would sit in conversations with our executive team and senior leaders about how do we 2x, double the time that people spend in Instagram? And that's very much like a business objective. The more time that you spend in Instagram, the more time that you're browsing the news feed, the more impressions of advertisements that you get, the more money the company makes. But that doesn't really matter much to the user. And in my opinion, I didn't really think it was a good use of people's time to be spending twice as much time in Instagram. So when I was looking for a new opportunity, I really wanted to somewhere that was having an impact and adding value in the world. And I remember when my wife and I were in Brazil, I was sitting in the back of an Uber car, and at the time, Brazil was having an economic crisis. So a lot of people, unfortunately, were losing their jobs. And this person had recently lost his job, but it was because of Uber that he was able to drive with them and actually make an income where he was able to provide for his family, including buying his daughter a gift for Christmas that year. And it just like struck a chord with me that this company and companies like it can have extreme value to the people who use it, both the riders and the drivers, as well as the other types of users within the ecosystem. So I joined Uber. I've been there a little over a year now, a year and 3 months. I'm a principal researcher, which means that I basically oversee some of our strategic research efforts in terms of where is the company going to be going next. So I've worked on a lot of products during my career, and one of the things that I want to talk to you today about is some of the lessons that I've learned developing these products and what I think that means for user research. So the first thing that I want to do, though, is I want to take you back to the beginning. And the beginning is 1990. So what's significant about 1990? What's significant about 1990. This was the first web page. It was nothing but some text and some blue links called hyperlinks that would take you to more text. It was a simpler time. Could you imagine being a UX researcher working on this? Can you please click on the blue link? But if we actually fast forward to today, we're living in a much more complicated world. A lot's changed since then. Our websites are now dynamic. In fact, we don't even really call them websites anymore. We call them web applications. Gmail is a classic example of one of the first web applications, or a single-page web application. The iPhone really caused a mobile revolution, where a lot of the computing that we actually do today is living in our pockets or in our hand, and it's with us on the go. And instead of using applications on desktops, we're tending to use applications on our phones. A lot of this was not only popularized by Apple, but now with Android as well. It's like basically we have these two global behemoths which have enabled nearly every person on the world, or with enough money, to have a mobile device. There's been a lot of advancements in mobile web technology as well. So much so that it's really hard to actually tell the difference between a mobile application and a mobile website. Computing devices, they no longer live on our desks. They live in our pockets. They live in our wrists. They live in our ears, and even on our embedded devices like TVs and fridges. Let's also take a moment to think about the way or the types of products that we're building. We actually care a lot more about design these days than what we used to back then. Thanks to Apple, back in when Steve Jobs actually took over Apple, he had a purpose around how design would be the center of the company and the products that we were building. For those of you who have bought an Apple device recently and you open up the box, you'll see designed in California, made in China. We also get products that are basically developed in an instant. Think back to when I was at Microsoft and I told you it took 3 years to actually build Office. When I joined Google, they would ship a new version of Chrome every 6 weeks. The time that I left Google, they were shipping a new version of Chrome every 2 weeks. When I joined Instagram, they release a new version of Instagram every 2 weeks. Facebook, they release it in minutes, in hours. They have continuous development. As soon as a developer pushes code and it passes the tests, it's shipped to the world to be used. When I was at Microsoft, a VP said to me, designing Office is like ordering a pizza for 500 million people. That actually seems small today compared to Facebook that has 2.38 billion users around the world. And then finally, we're living in a world of big data where we can basically do A/B experimentation and make informed, data-driven choices. So what does this mean for UX research? And that's what I want to talk about, some of the traits of the modern UX researcher, at least how I see them. And also one trait that I think that we should be considering for our future as well. So the first, user experience researchers need to be fast, like Usain Bolt. Once upon a time, I was at Instagram and I was at my desk and a PM walks up to me and he says, Andy, we need to understand when people are browsing their Instagram feed and they see a video, should we play the audio immediately or should we actually have it muted? And I was like, okay. And then he stopped me and said, we need to know by Friday. It was Wednesday afternoon. So I was like, okay, can you spend the rest of the day crafting like a research script with me? And he was like, yes, I'll move my meetings. I was like, great. What we're going to do is we're going to make a research plan, and then tomorrow we're going to go over to the mall, and we're going to give 2 different prototypes to people. One that has audio playing when they come across a video, and then another where it will be muted. And he was like, okay. And you also have to bring some of your team with you to actually do this work with me, because I can't do it alone. So him and 2 engineers actually went with me to this mall, and we would actually be giving people this prototype with Instagram, and they would be scrolling the feed, and then sometimes audio would play, and sometimes it wouldn't. And we'd basically get their reaction in a public space to how they actually coped with these experiences. And also in the case of the version that didn't have audio playing, did they know how to actually turn on the audio? And the idea was that in the car going back to the office, we debriefed on what we learned, and that information would actually be used in the product review that was happening the next day. Okay, user experience research also has to be able to scale. And what I mean by this is we also talked about like how products today, they're global. We need to scale beyond the lab. We need to be able to scale beyond the country that we're operating in. And we also have to scale beyond the researcher who's actually conducting the research. Okay, so once again, like an example of this was time at Uber. I was working on this analysis that many researchers here would be familiar with. I have a whole bunch of textual data from research participants. And they were actually, the story was that Uber Eats was doing a partnership with Starbucks and we're piloting it out. And I was basically getting reviews from people who were making these orders and I was coding the data. I'm sure many researchers have done like coding work before, where they'll read a open-ended text response and then they'll assign it a code in terms of what that might mean. So we had this pilot happening in Miami and I was writing this query and then I was pulling all this data and I was coding it. And then it was getting to the point that we were going to be expanding from 100 stores to over 2,000 stores. So just to give you a bit of context, it took me about every 3 days, I would spend about an hour analyzing this data. So what I did was I took all the original analysis that I did with the open-ended text responses and the codes, and I was able to train a neural network to do all the analysis for me. And basically what I was able to do is get an 88.6% accuracy rate of the codifying the open-ended text responses. And then was able to set up a job that basically analyzed these responses every day. So it went from me doing 3 hours of work, or an hour of work every 3 days, to me doing 0 work when we actually increased the number of data that I had to add. We also have to be able to deal with complex situations. So when I first joined Uber and I was working on a Uber Eats project, we had this question about how do people eat? Which is a very like ambiguous, open-ended question. So one of the things that we did was actually used a tool called Dscout, which is a mobile application for collecting data. It's a diaries tool, so I was able to recruit people from all over the US. We had over 100 participants who were basically keeping a food diary. This is an example of what Dscout looks like, where as someone was going through, opening up the application, they were basically presented with different questions and they could upload a picture or they could answer some questions. Now, one of the things that happened then was Dscout works great for the US. It has over 100,000 users that can actually use the application and have it installed, and then you can just recruit them to participate in a study. But then we had the problem of, okay, we want to do this in Latin America next. How do we do this? And Latin America is, there are many different countries there as well, so we wanted to focus on Brazil and Colombia and Mexico, for example. But Dscout is not available there. So we had, okay, how do we actually handle this situation? Well, let's try and replicate getting information from people in the same way by asking them questions, but doing it through an application that they do have. So we asked them all to use WhatsApp, and we actually hired an agency to actually ping them the questions at different types of the day. That was basically, this is not an example of the questions that we used. We basically had over 300 people in Latin America, and they were asked these questions in Spanish through an application that they did have on their phones and they were using every day. So always try to be thinking about the modality, the audience that you're working with, how they're getting, how you're going to be capturing data from them in a way that makes sense for them. Researchers also need to have impact. And one way to get a seat at the table is if we go to the next slide, suddenly a PM seat's available at the table. But one of the stories that I want to talk about is like we all know that we have to have impact. Another story from when I was at Google, I was sitting at home, and my wife was at her computer, and I was at the dining room table, and she asked me to come over and see something on the computer. So I walked over, and she opened up the browser. It looked something like this. I'm sure we've all been there, where we have a lot of tabs open, and she was clicking around to show me the thing that she wanted to show me, but she couldn't find it. Why do you have so many tabs open? She goes, in case I need to get back to something, or I might want to go back to it. I'm not sure if it could have been the case that she just went looking for the tab and reopened it, but she didn't complain about it. Now, the problem with this was that I can't scale to every single person in the world and close their tabs. So what I did was I wrote a program that it monitored how tabs were being used, and if a tab wasn't being used, it would close it. It wouldn't close it completely, it would actually keep a reference to it that people could get back to. The engineering team loved this. They was like, this is great. But they saw a different reason in it, because when you close a tab, or if you actually kill the process of the tab, you are reducing the memory footprint of the browser. And if you're reducing the memory footprint of the browser, you're also increasing the processing speed. So out of this work, I was able to I'd invented an algorithm that got put into Chrome, and is basically being used by over 1 billion people around the world, whether using Chrome on their desktop, or on their Chromebook, or on their mobile device. Not only that, we was also able to get a patent application out of this, which is now issued around the world. And all of this from one observation of a human. Researchers also have to be creative. Or if this is Coco Chanel, and of her time, she was a fashion pioneer. If you want more of a modern reference, we can go to the next slide, and we can think more about Daenerys Targaryen. She used to say in Game of Thrones, and hopefully we have a few Game of Thrones fans here, because we need to break the wheel. We need to do things differently. Now, I want to take you back to that example of the Instagram audio feed. We ended up going into that product review. I got invited to it. I got a seat at the table. One thing I want to say about seats at the table, don't ask to have a seat at the table. Just focus on your work, and you'll be invited to the table. So I got invited to the table, and I didn't actually want to sit at the table, so I sat at the back of the room. And people are basically talking about the data analysis that they had in terms of the number of people who had their audio all the way down, or at whatever level that they had it within the Instagram app, if they had their phone on mute or not. And they was also talking about the user research in terms of some of the things that worked well about not playing audio, in terms of it wasn't as jarring when the audio immediately started playing. But at the same time, if they did want to hear the audio, there was an issue of, well, they'd missed a little bit of it because they had to tap on the video in order to then hear the audio that was playing for that. So everyone's arguing about what's the right thing to be doing. And I'm sat at the back of this room, and this is a room full of executives, C-levels, VPs, directors. I just did one thing. I turned the volume up on my phone all the way to the max. And then I opened up Instagram, and I started browsing my feed until I hit a video. Dun, 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 dun. Everyone in the room turns around and looks at me. And I said, sorry, I was just browsing my Instagram feed. They didn't put audio on default. I couldn't show this is what we used to do at Facebook and Instagram. It's called a HPM. It's called highlights, people, and me. So the highlights would be, this is the research that we did this half. So the blue thing would be like a title and a link to the research report. Then underneath there would be like a little snippet about this is what we did. This is like the major key takeaway. The whole company used to do these, or every team used to do them. And looking at it, it's just a bunch of text and links. It was pretty boring. They didn't really get much engagement. I never knew if anyone was really looking at it. So what we did this. We made a comic book instead. Engagement went through the roof, and everyone's talking about it, about how different it was. And they actually read it, and they went to the links. Everyone apart from my manager, who said, can you go back to the other format? But I replied back to him, and I said, would you rather have someone working in your team who just follows the status quo, or actually tries new things? Now, this is my final point here, is I believe This is not so much about today, but a lot of the examples that I presented with you is like there've been some degree of being able to, my background in coding has been very useful to my career in user research. And I think it's going to become more important in the future. Now, I'm not saying that every researcher has to write production-level software engineering code, but just enough to be dangerous and hack something together, whether it be a little prototype or maybe pull a little bit of data to support some qualitative insight. Now, the reason why I think this is important is that we're actually starting to see a change in the education where computer science is actually being taught alongside more of our traditional subjects, such as our math and our English, which means that the next generation of people who are going to be graduating from college and becoming designers and becoming user researchers are going to have some proficiency in being able to code, which is why I think that in the future this is something that we, as an industry here, have to be ready for. And say thanks.
Buka aja Bukalapak.